Before I start, let me very heartfully thank for the opportunity to be here. It's really a pleasure to be here in this for me, fairly unfamiliar environment of a performative symposium, and I'm really happy and inspired by this whole framework today. Okay, so as I mentioned, I changed the title and the topic, the focus of my topic a little bit from, I will not talk about empathy actually at all here. So please apologize and also be aware that anything I say here about emotional co-regulation, about this kind of feedback loops between affective lives of individuals has nothing in my eyes, at least, to do with empathy. But what I hope to shed a light on is this notion of emotional regulation. I think this is something that might have not been so much at the forefront so far, a little bit maybe in Thomas Fuchs' talk, and the embodied and social dimension especially. Okay, so let us just start with a number of very ordinary things we say sometimes or hear or have heard. Maybe the last one is not so actual anymore, I hope so, in terms of gender biases. But we do say and hear things like don't let your anger overcome you or dictate what you're saying, keep calm, or you have to control your feelings, or big boys don't cry, or you should do that and that if you have sadness mounting, etc. So what is right, what is noticeable in these locutions is, first of all, that there is some kind of normativity going on. So we think that you ought to do something with your emotions. And what is right in these sayings, I think, is the very general picture so far, or still very general picture, that emotions do not just come and go, and they also not just overcome passive subjects. So it's not that we are just some unwritten cognizers and unmoved cognizers, and then we have somehow emotions coming and going and we are passive towards them. But rather we monitor, we evaluate, and we ought to, this is the normative also, requirement upon us, actively regulate them. This is part and parcel of what you might call emotional socialization, which is one of the key socialization processes from early infancy through teenage years. So we educate, monitor, assess, evaluate our own emotions and those of others. So now the two guiding questions I want to address today is, first, how do we do this? So can we do this, and how we regulate which emotions we have, how we experience them, and how we express them, what are our means, and especially, of course, in the present context, what I want to highlight is the role of embodiment in this process. So in which sense is this regulation very profoundly and essentially an embodied process? So this is the first question, and I want to link that to the second related question, namely, in what sense are these embodied regulatory processes deeply and fundamentally socially shaped, socially on two levels, on interpersonal levels, so from, for example, from, as you will see briefly, shortly, from caregivers and children, for example, but also not just interpersonal, but depend and are modulated and embedded in social culture factors and social norms. Okay, so these are the guiding questions that I hope to address, at least in general terms. So this is the outline for what I'm going to do. First, say a little bit about what a bit more precisely emotion regulation is, and then move on to embodied and especially embodied co-regulation and its disruptions. I will present you also with one pathological cases of embodied disruptions of emotion, experience, and regulation, and then focus more on the interpersonal and the social culture regulation. Sorry, I just need a glass of water before we continue. Okay, so let's come then to the first topic, namely what is emotion regulation. So very generally still are all kinds of processes and strategies, and there are very different ones, as you will see, by which individuals and then individuals with other people influence which emotions they have, when they initiate them or experience them, and for how long, and how they express and experience those emotions. So this notion of emotion regulation have been very much researched. There has been an explosion actually of work in psychology, not in philosophy, in psychology, also in social, but especially in general psychology, since the work especially of James Gross, who has introduced this notion. But so what is it more specifically, what are these processes and strategies? So there are different processes and strategies to regulate the how, when, how long, how deeply, etc. of your emotions, and these are the most important ones, and they very often overlap and interlap. So imagine a situation where somebody, this is not very gender balanced, this picture, I excuse for that, I didn't find any better illustration for a primitive case like this, so an easy basic example like this. But just imagine somebody has chosen the situation of commuting by train back from work, maybe every day. We are in the rural area, this is what happens all the time here, and not taking the car for commuting, because he or she knows that he will become angry and choleric in the traffic jams every day. So there is already a selection of a situation that this person chose so as not even to let anger in this specific situation of commuting arise, potentially at least. But then he is in the dining room car having his red wine, and there is this crying, very sweet maybe baby, crying next to him, and he kind of feels annoyment maybe mounting in him. So what further means are there to kind of regulate not just the situation but his own emotions? So he can modify, he can try to still, after having selected already a situation where this regulatory process didn't work, modify subtly the situation. For example, a very easy modification would be he just stands up and goes out of this dining room car. Let's suppose that the two are not related. What a more subtle and more interesting modification and tailoring of the situation would be so as not to let his anger kind of explode, is to change his attentional deployment. So he tries to, by subtly, for example, looking out of the window, try to focus on the nice landscape, or gets a book to read and tries to kind of deploy his attention away from the specific situation that elicited this emotional reaction. A more robust and more interesting form, yet again, is what is sometimes called cognitive change or reappraisal. And this is also something that we constantly do, and what positive psychology tells us to do all the time, for better or worse. But reappraising, attaching different meanings cognitively also by conscious effort to a specific emotionally laden situation. So for example, he would try to tell himself, well, actually it was boring to sit here alone. The book was also too difficult. It's much more interesting to be around people. It's actually a sweet baby, etc., whatever it is, that he kind of tells himself to reappraise the original appraisal, which was horrible, annoyance, etc. And then response modulation, that could be all kinds of things, from subtle things that I will talk about just in a moment, of trying to really modulate, for example, his facial kind of expressive features in reaction so that he can calm himself down, setting up a neutral face, starting to smile at the mother maybe, to very drastic measures, getting drunk, for example. I mean, using props, that's obviously also something we do in order to regulate our moods, attunements, affections. Okay, so with this very general picture, this has nothing to do yet with embodied means, as you have seen, and has nothing to do with the social aspects, and this is what I'm going to focus upon now. So the embodied emotion thesis, I will be very brief about that, because as far as I've seen the slides from Thomas Fuchs, he has extensively dealt with it in a much better way, I'm sure, than I can do here. But just a general idea, a very basic idea what this embodied emotion thesis is, upon which then the further builds, is that emotions, and this is a very old thesis, but which has been very popular more recently, again, in the wake of a lot of social neuroscientists, psychologists, also philosophers. Damasio is probably the most well-known in this area, but Giovanna Colombetti is a colleague of mine in Exeter, and she has done very interesting work from phenomenology on these embodied dimensions. But the claim is very generally that emotions essentially, not just by coincidence because we are embodied, but for the very way emotions are and for the very fact what they are, they essentially depend on extraneural bodily components. So as you will see, facial expressions, etc. And not only on brain processes, or on not only on very specific bodily reactions, but our whole embodied being as such. So emotions are literally composed of, partly at least composed of, and enact upon perceptual, motoric, and these are all embodied features, of course, perceptual, motoric, autonomic, somatovisceral processes, and others. Notice that the claim is not identical, and this, I think, as far as I've seen, has been also mentioned by Thomas Fuchs. So it builds upon, but it is not simply the James Lange view, which has been very influential, both in psychology as well as in philosophy, that emotions are simply are identical to, they are nothing but or reducible to the awareness of bodily changes. So the view of James really is a fascinating view, and it has a lot to comment for itself, I think, but I think that's not the full story. But James really had the view that emotions are nothing else but your awareness of your bodily changes. So bodily changes related to emotion, so crying, having a slump posture, etc., having a stomach nervousness, etc. And the emotion is your awareness of that change. That's it. This is the famous quote from him: "We feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble, and it's not the case that we cry, strike, or tremble because we are sorry, angry, or fearful." So he reverses this order that we usually think of, which is also not true, I think. The reverse is also not the full story, so that we simply have somewhere, somehow, some things called emotions, and we just express them by crying or by trembling, etc. But James had the opposing extreme view, that he said we are afraid because we tremble. But this embodied emotion thesis is, again, not identical to this claim. So what I think one of these pictures at least has been shown by Thomas Fuchs also, so very briefly, what has been demonstrated is that very arbitrarily induced facial muscle contraction. So if I put this pen into my teeth and try to hold it, and I'm not told to express smile, I'm just told do that facial muscle task, it has an effect on, for example, emotionally laden preference choices, that I'm in a quasi-happy state or smiling state. Of course, it's not a happy state, but there's some kind of correlation between the sheer facial muscle imitating a smile and associated emotions and preferences. And in turn, and this is what I'm going to show you in the next slide, in turn, this is more interesting, I think, if motor movements are inhibited, facial motoric movements or other embodied motor movements are inhibited, so disturbed pathologically or otherwise, this has in turn negative interferences with the possibility of emotional, not just expression obviously, but experience of emotions. And as psychologists would put it, the processing of emotional information. So here we have a very rare disease, congenital disease, so from birth, which is a complete bilateral, so both sides facial paralysis. It's a very rare genetic disease, but called Möbius syndrome. So these patients here illustratively suffer from this Möbius syndrome from birth, and the symptoms are strabism, so that's what's called cross-eyedness, often hand and foot problems, clumsiness, poor coordination, like bodily coordination, but also language development delays, sometimes correlated with even autism and learning disabilities. But why is this now interesting for us? Because it's not only these, the symptoms are not only these, but very straightforwardly and probably not very surprisingly, these patients report about themselves report often about a diminished sense of their very embodiment. And of course, these are embodied agents, obviously. And yet, what seems to often lack for them is the sense of the body as a subject. Instead, what they have foregrounded often because of these impairments is the sense of the body as an object like other objects, and like other people's bodies also sometimes are objects to us, to all of us. So it's what might be called sometimes also body image. So they have a body image of their own body, but the body schema is disturbed. I will use this notion of body schema later. But it is also what they also report, and what is also very clear, that they have a disturbed, obviously expressive facial mimicry capacities, and hence also report and experience diminished emotional experiences, and especially possibilities to regulate their emotions. And this in turn leads to feelings of a lack of social intimacy. So not just a lack of self-intimacy with regard to their own bodies, but a lack of a sense of being cut off from other people. Even though, assuming that most of these patients can very well communicate, I mean, linguistically or verbally, it's not that they wouldn't be able to linguistically or communicatively speak. So this is just two quotes from patients saying, I sort of think happy or think sad, not really recognizing actually feeling happy or feeling sad. I have to intellectualize mood. So here we have this, even the emotions are somehow thought of and are objectified, not lived through in this sense, or at least not typically so. Another patient says, I think also that I have a fear of being out of control with emotions, feeling something that I can't manage. So here we have a clear case of a disruption of emotion regulation capacities, which have to do with facial mimicry disturbances and with disturbances in the expression also of emotions. Okay, now with this also note on regulation and on co-regulation, for example, in the facial mimicry case, and with this kind of hint and the aspect of sociality, I want to now turn to the last session, which is hopefully the most interesting one, and here again, just to recall, what I want to do is, in the first slide in this brief video, you will see a clear case of interpersonal co-regulation. Co-regulation here means regulating your emotions with others, not just simply parallel with others, but really aiding one another in doing so. and modulating, shaping one's emotions and emotion regulations with the help or the lack of the help of the other. And the second aspect that I also subsume under this sociality is a much more robust form, where really social culture norms, expectations, cultures of attention deployment, perceptual cultures of perceptual differences, etc., come into play and shape these different regulatory processes. So let's see here first. This is a short video that I want to show you. I apologize. I think most of you know this, maybe not this video, but this experiment. If not, the better, then I think it's really worth watching it once. But it's a very famous psychological paradigm, an early one from late 70s, called the still face experiment. And I use this, even though it's very well known, because I think it extremely well shows the interpersonal co-regulation in a parent-infant interaction of an emotional regulation.
In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay.
Yeah, it is very sweet, but also somehow distressing, I think, to watch this. It's, especially if you know it and know what's going to happen. But so I think it doesn't need much explanation. There was also much explanation going on. But what I just want you to notice also, and this isn't so clear, of course, from this example, because it's a laboratory setting and not an ordinary, obviously not an ordinary exchange between mother and infant. But obviously these processes of emotional co-regulation, especially in this tightly interpersonal dyadic situations, are bidirectional. So it's not just also when it has to do with a very young infant who wouldn't communicate like linguistically or verbally communicate, but the emotions feed back from both sides, and we have this kind of emotional kind of dialogue also, which affects your own emotions, obviously. So this was co-regulation, interpersonal co-regulation, and just so much on that that it's clear that, especially, of course, in infants' socialization and emotional education, but also later on in life, obviously, other people's emotional expressions, registers, appraisals, types of appraisals, to put it very simply, what they like and what affects them also emotionally, but also what kind of situations they choose in order to have certain kind of emotions, etc., and what responses they have to those situations. These affect ourselves. These affect our own emotional repertoires and our own emotional appraisals and regulations. So, and especially when it comes to role models, significant others, caretakers, doctors, in social workers, etc., and friends, obviously. So this would be the interpersonal cases, but notice that this, of course, these in these co-regulatory processes are themselves, of course, heavily embedded and shaped by the social cultural context of emotional socialization and regimenting itself. And this is what I want to now talk just a little bit about as a finishing. So one rather funny action, maybe not very interesting, but still curious study. And this is, of course, not a very interesting social culture phenomenon, but still a social phenomenon, that it has been even shown fairly recently that and here we talk really about newborns who obviously can't speak or understand any of the language of their native tongue or any other tongue. But there seems to be strong correlations between different melodies of crying and their native language melodies and differences. So here it's not even so different languages like German and French, but as you can see the pattern of the typical, obviously these are just typified or typical melodies, cry melodies are very different. Okay, this is maybe just more curious than revealing, but still, this is, I think, a way more interesting and way more complex also study. So just so that you understand the setting, it doesn't really matter on which picture you focus. It goes for both. It has been just differentiated to factor in or to see whether kind of the change from like Western face in the middle and Asian changes anything in the respective different, ethnically different experimental subject, but that doesn't really matter. What the point is, it's a study in cross-cultural psychology done by Japanese psychologists in the US, 2 different studies, which has shown that given the different and from very early on socialized differences in attentional deployment when it comes to reading, as it were, emotions in a collective of people, the differences between Asian and especially Japanese, but not only, like Japanese and Eastern Asian cultures of deploying so-called, what they call more holistic patterns of attentional deployment versus the more individualistic one in Western context, they have a difference on how Westerners and Asians, to put it simply, read, as it were, and say what the emotion, the facial expression of the central figure is. So if you just look at the above one, Asian participants in this study have consistently rated the central figure as less happy expression, or they have been just asked what is kind of the emotion expressed in this picture. And they would tend towards some kind of neutral. It wouldn't be really sadness, but it tends rather to kind of, it's a kind of sad, neutral expression. Whereas Westerners, with the more focused individualistic attentional deployment focusing on the central figure, would say it's a happy face. It's and this has been in different studies quite consistently shown. I find that very interesting because it shows that very subtle ways of socializing, training, and culture influences on that, how to deploy attention, for example, when it comes to a group of people, has an effect on how to decode, for example, not just, but also emotional information distributed in this. And this has, we can talk about this in the context of empathy, of course, also then later, maybe. Now, so what and this is kind of coming towards the end, what I want to introduce here as a kind of a term that I find very useful, that hasn't been very highly conceptualized, but very nicely illustrated by the Israeli sociologist Eva Illus, who has worked, I think, also in Germany quite a bit, who has worked on a lot on sociology of emotion, and she has coined this term emotional habitus. And what I want to also kind of introduce in this context is what I want to call affective body cultures, or affective body habitus. And as you will see, habitus is an embodied notion from the very start, actually, in Husserl, the phenomenologist, and through Bourdieu. It had always to do with incorporation of norms and also affective norms. So building on, but significantly, I would suggest that we should look extending the notion of just interpersonal effects in these very kind of basic, also laboratory settings that developmental psychologists especially study, to more robust forms of how social culture factors shape, modulate our affective lives. And here is another notion that I find extremely interesting and useful, also from a feminist sociologist, Arlie Hochschild, who was especially famous in the 80s, but still is working on a lot of interesting issues related both to issues of feminist agendas in sociology, but also at the in her early work on emotion management and emotion regulation. And she has introduced this notion of feeling norms. And what I want to suggest that we have these feeling norms, which are basically implicit, very much implicitly employed, enacted, and in a way internalized, very much internalized norms of expressing and managing one's own emotions, which are also very much culturally different norms, of course, and they sediment themselves to what I would suggest to call something like an emotional habitus and affective body cultures. And on the other hand, it's not just really norms that sediment themselves in that sense on the level of the body, but also what other sociologists would call, Randall Collins has a wonderful book on interaction ritual chains, where he analyzes interaction rituals, micro rituals. One ritual would be here, what we have, being in a museum, culture, context, giving a talk, etc. This is some kind of, it is a ritual, but a ritual would also be food rituals, smoking rituals, workout, leisure, dancing, important example, of course, in present context. And they also sediment themselves robustly on the level of the body and on the level of embodied culture. And here I just want to close with very, I think, illustrative quotes from Bourdieu and Merleau-Ponty. And it is maybe not so well known, I think not even among sociologists, at least they don't much talk about it, that habitus, by this notion of habitus that Bourdieu systematically introduced, but that he actually takes up from Husserl, the phenomenologist, who speaks about habitualities, that it is really a notion that is essentially and intrinsically tied to embodiment for Bourdieu. So he says, for example, arms and legs are full of numb imperatives, so this normative element. One could endlessly enumerate the values given body, made body, injunctions as insignificant as sit up straight or don't, hold your knife or don't hold your knife in your left hand, inscribe the most fundamental principles of the arbitrary content of a culture in seemingly innocuous details of bearing, posture, way of eating, way of holding your knife, etc. And this is what he calls habitus. He says in another word, the body is the most indisputable materialization of class taste. But we can also add here not just classes, but social cultural aspects too, more broadly. A way of treating it, of treating the body, of caring for it, of feeding it, maintaining it, which reveals the deepest dispositions of the habitus. And this notion of the habitus as a bodily notion embodied notion. We find also in Merleau-Ponty, who was probably the most elaborate, I think, philosopher of embodiment and the most systematic one also. And he says the bodily, for example, this is one among many similar quotes, bodily space is a matrix of his habitual action. Consciousness has a body as it projects itself into a culture world and has its habits. So you can't separate consciousness from the body, of course, but it is tied to culture and the culture world through its habits, which are very much shaped by the bodily space. Okay, and here is just the conclusion. So what I wanted to suggest implicitly and also explicitly with this talk is that we should move, and that has been done somewhat lately in philosophy of emotions, also in psychology, to move beyond cognitivism, but also beyond individualism regarding emotions. So in other works, I'm dealing a lot actually with collective emotions, not so much with this interpersonal and social culture phenomenon, but with really group emotions, etc. But I think on all kinds of levels when we talk about emotions, but also maybe empathy, maybe we can discuss that later, we should rethink our individualism, not just our rationalism and not just our cognitivism and representationalism, but our individualism regarding those. And we should do that by emphasizing and of course not underplaying its embodied dimensions. But these embodied dimensions themselves are very much socially shaped. And doing this, I think we should take into account not just the neurosciences, of course, and not just developmental psychology and not just sociology, but social and cultural psychology and the sociology of emotions. There is really a lot of very interesting work in sociology of emotions and embodiment. And highlight these social culture factors that play an important and essential role in shaping and modulating emotion regulation and emotions in generally. And here I just, this is very sketchy, of course, these notions just would suggest might be useful to look at these notions of emotional habitus and shared body schemas. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for interesting insights into our emotions. Hört man das jetzt so gut? Okay. Does anyone have a question for Dr. Thomas Santo? It will be a very short question and answer period because we have a coffee break and after that we'll do a talk. I bring you the microphone.
Yes, thank you. Just to add one aspect, because I'm a little bit missing it. What about power structures and why people are forced into certain behaviors? If you're focusing emotional regulation, and you know, it kind of has a notion of, oh yeah, you can do it yourself and you find your way with it, and even the cultural sphere is more made because of economic and I don't know, the way we are born in this way of living. How do you employ that in your theory work?
Thanks really a lot. This is not just a great question, but great that you add this aspect because it is very important for me. I have completely left it out here, that's true. A little bit alluded to it with this emotion norm concept of Hochschild because she uses it as a very critical notion, especially, so her analysis, and this is where in another paper I have built on that for trying to show that these emotion norms in exploitative framework, for example, in the service industry that Hochschild is elaborating in this emotional capitalism, they lead to what I have called emotional self-alienation, that you and what Hochschild suggests but doesn't really elaborate, so a feeling of estrangement from your own emotions and from the emotions of others. And this is a very negative and very problematic, of course, aspect of it that has to do precisely with exploitation, with power balances, and with capitalists also means. So just to give you the background, for Hochschild, so what is, so she analyzes a corporate setting of air flight attendants, stewardesses, if you will, who are systematically, and has been, especially I think in the 80s, it was probably more prevalent, like systematically really trained to regulate precisely their emotions in order to enhance the profits, basically smiling, being nice, down-regulating their anger, their feelings of stress, etc., etc. And she has analyzed that over the course of many years and interviewed dozens of those flight attendants, and has come to the conclusion that what this leads to, and this is just one example of many, is precisely a complete emotional numbness, if you will, not just in those situations, but in general. So there is also a sedimentation of these disturbances by an over-regulation. And I think this is just one example, and maybe we can discuss it on the podium. This is what I'm interested in more now, how social media and internet phenomena and digitalization phenomena have similar effects on our affective lives, which have not just to do with regulation, but with emotional manipulation. So thanks for this. I have here left it out, it's true, but I think it's a very important aspect of this research.
I think there are questions enough, and I would suggest we just continue at 4 p.m. here on that place, at that place. Wir treffen uns 4 Uhr wieder hier. Now it's time for the coffee break, and we can talk about all that in the talk.